In our last section, we were looking at some of the reasons why the president's power has grown. We were looking at why the president's power has expanded from one president to the next. Now we want to look at how the president's power expands. So we're going to start to go through some tools that the president has that allows the president's power to expand from one president to the next. What we see in the picture here, here's President Trump proudly holding up one of his executive orders. This is a thing that President Trump routinely does. I don't really understand, but he really likes to show the public his executive orders. So here he is holding up one of his proud executive orders. So we'll talk about what executive orders are and what they do. So to start, let's look at the way that things should work according to the plan in the Constitution. The Constitution tells the president that he can recommend policy, and the Constitution clearly outlines that the Congress will be making the policy. So the plan under the Constitution, if the president wants a law, what the president needs to do is if they want to pass some piece of major legislation, they're going to need to ask Congress. So they'll recommend to Congress that a law be passed, and they'll do what they can to persuade Congress to pass something that the president likes. So the president might identify a problem, or the president might even say, here's a solution I want, and he'll tell Congress. He'll say, like, this is what I think would be a good plan, and then the president will do what it takes persuasion-wise to try to convince Congress to pass the law that the president prefers. Laws come from Congress. Those laws are pretty permanent. So when Congress passes a law, it takes a lot to get rid of that law. In fact, that law can only be repealed by a Congress in the future. So when Congress passes a law, it's permanent until Congress chooses to act to change that law or to get rid of that law. So here's our system, and this would include the president and the legislative branch here. Basically, our step-by-step how a law becomes a reality. We would end up with the president recommending a law. So the president using their power as chief legislator to propose a solution to a potential problem, possibly at the State of the Union address or something like that. But the president recommends a law to Congress. Then, the next step, the president is going to work to persuade members of Congress to pass the law that the president likes. So the president may be using their relationships with congressmen that they've had in the past. The president may be exchanging favors, like the president has the ability to, with allies, he can, maybe he'll visit that congressman's district. He'll help that congressman on the campaign trail or something like that. But the president will do what they can to persuade members of Congress. And step 3, Congress writes the bill. Congress creates the policy, and Congress votes and passes the policy. Now we're going back to our lesson on Congress, on how a bill becomes a law. We're going through a very complicated process, including the congressional leadership and the committees and the conference committees and all that kind of stuff. So, a million opportunities there for the bill to die or to be messed up. But if we are successful and Congress has passed a law, the last step, the law returns to the president's desk, and the president signs the bill into law and begins implementing or enforcing the law. So if everything worked out, the president started by recommending a policy, and the president ends up with a policy passed by Congress that the president prefers. And the president can carry that policy out. So what happens if it doesn't work? What happens if Congress will not cooperate with the president? The president has another tool. The president has what we call executive orders. An executive order is just a directive that the president issues, and this goes out to the bureaucracy, the many, many, many offices that are helping the president carry out the policy across the country on a day-by-day basis. The president sends this directive to the bureaucracy that tells them how to implement the policy. Here, the president is issuing a statement saying, here's how the bureaucracy should be implementing something. And since the president is in charge of the bureaucracy, they can change the way that the bureaucracy does things. They don't need Congress to get involved when they are giving the bureaucracy directions about how to carry out the law. That's the president's executive power, right? The president, the Constitution says, the president take care that the laws be executed. So here the president just tells the agencies, here's how to execute the law, and they may be changing small details about how the law gets carried out. The problem with executive orders, that unlike a law that Congress passed, they are not very permanent. a president, like a new president, can replace the old president's executive orders simply by writing a new executive order. In fact, the first day of each new president usually signs dozens of executive orders that just reverse the policies of the president that came before them. So an executive order is pretty temporary, like it's only going to last as long as that particular president or other presidents that agree with them are in office. But executive orders allow the president to change little details of the law without Congress getting involved. Now, if Congress doesn't like the executive order, Congress has the power to pass a law that changes the executive order. Congress's laws are the most important. So if the president issues an executive order, Congress can pass a law the opposite of the executive order, and that congressional law is going to take precedence. So here's our step-by-step process for how an executive order happens, right? In this case, we're going to start with a situation where, maybe the president has proposed something to Congress, but Congress will not cooperate with the president. So the president issues an executive order. Step 2, that's it. They just write an executive order. Step 3, the government agencies automatically implement the changes that the president wished for. So step 2 and 3 happen very quickly. The president says, do this. The agencies start doing it. And here we are in step 4. The effects to the American public are the same. No law was passed. Congress didn't get involved here, but the effects that we feel are the same because the policy is being carried out by the president and their executive branch. So executive orders are very quick. Executive orders do not require Congress. Executive orders to the public feel exactly the same as a law. The big difference here is that they're not very permanent. They're going to last for the president that is in office, but not last much longer than that. Now, in general, people don't like executive orders. Your average person has no idea what an executive order is. But the president may be criticized for using executive orders often. The president is more likely to be issuing a lot of executive orders when the Congress is controlled by the party that the president is not a part of, controlled by the opposition party. So since this has been the norm in American politics recently, the number of executive orders that modern presidents have used is a lot. So here, these numbers are not important for you to know, but we just want to see that each president is issuing a ton of executive orders, hundreds of executive orders. We've got 381 executive orders for Reagan's 2 terms, 364 for Clinton's, 291 for Bush, and 296 for Obama. Now, President Trump, not even finished with his single term in office, has already issued almost 200 executive orders. So he's getting close to the numbers that Bush and Obama did in twice the time, because President Trump had a hard time getting Congress to cooperate with him. And when a president cannot get Congress to cooperate, we end up with a tremendous amount of policy taking place through executive order instead of congressional lawmaking. Now, this chart shows us the number of executive orders issued per day by each president that we've had. So it goes all the way back to George Washington. You'll see that those early presidents very, very rarely issued executive orders at all. We see that number start to grow just a little bit under Lincoln and the presidents that followed Lincoln. But when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, right around 1900, that is when we have a tremendous increase in the number of executive orders that were passed. So the presidents really started to become strong in the 20th century, starting around the year 1900. Presidents really started to take a much bigger role in policy making. If you can see, I know it's small print there, but President Franklin Roosevelt, with all of his time in office, he issued almost one executive order every day. So these presidents in the early 20th century were really, really making a ton of use of the executive order. And then the presidents in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century have really reduced the amount of executive orders that they are using. But it's still way more than the presidents, the early presidents that we had. President Barack Obama actually issued executive orders at the lowest rate. He got criticized for using executive orders a lot, but it's actually the lowest rate since presidents in the 1800s. So that's just kind of to show us how we are critical of presidents who use executive orders, even though that the use of executive orders has been declining a little bit with modern presidents. Not so much with Trump. Trump has issued an enormous amount of executive orders, and we'll see what that looks like under Biden. But this shows us a couple things here. Shows us how the use of executive orders has increased. And statistically here, we have a few more executive orders on average from Republican presidents than Democratic presidents. It doesn't really mean much, but each of these parties will criticize presidents of the other party for using executive orders. Right, a similar tool for our presidents. We're going to go through this one quickly. It's just as important, though. We also have executive agreements. Right, executive agreements are another tool that presidents have that are just like, they do the exact same thing as executive orders, but they are for treaties. So an executive agreement is when the president, if they know that the Senate is not going to ratify the treaty that they agree to, the president can resort to an executive agreement. This is just where two world leaders get together and they make a deal with each other. Now, if each of them agrees to a deal and each of them implements the deal, it's the same as a treaty as far as you or I are concerned. It feels the same. The effects are the same. But the executive agreement, just like the executive order, may only last for the president that's currently in office. But when the president is confronting a Senate that is not going to agree to the treaty that they negotiate, then the president can resort to an executive agreement. They just make the executive agreement with another world leader. They put the executive agreement into action because they control the bureaucracy. And when the president makes the executive agreement and implements them, to me, to the public, that's exactly the same as a treaty. It just was not ratified by the Senate. Now, just like an executive order, the next president can come along and get rid of all these executive agreements, but the executive agreement is a way that the president can do something faster, that the president can do something when Congress won't cooperate. One more tool we want to talk about for a minute here. Another tool that has been used more with our modern presidents. We're going to talk about what we call signing statements. So this will be a situation where the president is approving a law that has been passed by Congress, but they are basically adding their 2 cents about what they think about the law. They're not just writing their name on the law, they are signing the law and issuing a statement about how they feel about the law. So signing statements are not totally brand new. The signing statements go all the way back to James Madison, but our modern presidents have really started to use signing statements a lot to increase their influence over lawmaking in Congress. So what a signing statement is the president issues a written statement when they sign the bill into law. And what this statement does, the president may explain their philosophy. They make a statement about, like, here's this law I signed today, and here's what it means. And they may be explaining their political philosophy, but they're also going to include directions for their agencies, directions for the bureaucracy about how to apply the law. They're going to include the president's interpretation of the Constitution, basically saying, I signed this law today, and here's how I think that the Constitution deals with this law, and here's how I want my agencies to act in accordance with the way I feel about the Constitution and this law. So the presidents take this opportunity to discuss their thoughts on the law that they are signing. And so more modern presidents, especially starting with Reagan, we got a lot of signing statements. But really, with President George W. Bush, signing statements really started to increase, where the president was signing a law that Congress passed, but the president was including a lot about how they interpreted the law and what they thought the law would mean and how they planned to carry out the law. In the signing statement, the president is going to include statements about how they plan to implement the law. At least in our modern signing statements, this is what a lot of them will do. So the president will say, here's the law I am signing today, and I have these thoughts about the law, and so I want my agencies to carry out the law in this way. They might describe how they think that some parts of these laws are unconstitutional. So they might say, like, here's a law that Congress passed today, but I disagree with this detail of the law because it goes against this part of the Constitution in terms of how I feel about the Constitution. So they're including their interpretation. They might say this part of the law is bad, and therefore I'm not going to put this part of the law into effect. They may include directions for their government agencies about how they want these policies implemented. So the president is issuing a statement. They're saying, here, I'm approving this law that Congress wrote today, but here's how I want my agencies to carry out the law. And it may not be the way that Congress intended. So the presidents can use the signing statements in this way. They can sign the law. They can give their directions to the law enforcers or whoever's implementing the law, who's carrying out the law, and they can cause the law to be implemented in a way that the president likes that may not be the way that Congress intended. The signing statements here, these are another important tool of the president to influence policymaking. Presidents are able to increase the amount of influence that they have over laws that Congress passed. All right, so what we've talked about here, we've got a couple of tools of the president, the executive order and the signing statement. These are ways for the president to increase their powers over policy making. Through executive order, the president can just make policy very quickly without Congress. Through signing statement, the president is able to possibly change the meaning of a law that Congress passed. So just a couple of ways that the president is really able to increase their power over lawmaking. So what we said we wanted to do today, we wanted to explain how the president has such a large role in policymaking, and executive orders and signing statements are certainly a couple of parts of that. We'll look at some informal powers of the president next and see how the president's power has continued to grow.